Imagine this. It's July. The year is 1518. You live in the city of Strasbourg, a bustling medieval hub nestled along the Rhine River in what is now northeastern France. Life is hard. Crops have failed, disease is rampant, and people are hungry, frightened and desperate. Then, on a sweltering summer morning, a woman steps out of her home onto the cobblestone, and she begins to dance. No music, no celebration, just dancing. Frantic, convulsive, unstoppable dancing. She dances through the afternoon and into the night. Her feet bleed. Her husband begs her to stop, but she can't. By the end of the week, 30 more people have joined her. By the end of the month, 400. And some of them will dance until they die. This is the story of the dancing plague of 1518, one of the most bizarre, terrifying and strangely human events in all of recorded history. To understand why the dancing plague happened, you first have to understand the world these people were living in, because 1518 Strasbourg was, by almost any measure, a city on the edge of collapse. Strasbourg sat at a critical crossroads of trade routes in the Holy Roman Empire. Prosperous, yes, but also densely crowded and deeply vulnerable. And in the years leading up to 1518, the city had been battered by one catastrophe after another. There had been a string of devastating harvests, famine was spreading, grain prices had reached the highest levels in over a generation, meaning ordinary people were struggling just to eat. On top of that, a fresh wave of bubonic plague had returned to haunt the region. Syphilis, a relatively new and terrifying disease at the time, was spreading rapidly. Even leprosy, thought by many to be a punishment from God, was making a return. And if all that weren't enough, there were signs and omens. A comet had blazed across the sky in 1492. Religious tension was simmering. Martin Luther had just nailed his 95 Theses to a church door 1 year earlier in 1517, sending shockwaves through European Catholicism. The world felt like it was ending, because for many people in Strasbourg, it genuinely was. Medical historian John Waller, who has written extensively on this subject, described these as appallingly harsh years for the people of Alsace, even by the grueling standards of the Middle Ages. The psychological weight on ordinary citizens was immense. It is in this pressure cooker of fear, hunger, illness, and spiritual dread that our story truly begins. On the 14th of July, 1518, a woman named Frau Troffea, her full name lost to history, stepped out of her home onto a narrow, cobbled street in Strasbourg and began to dance. There was no music, no festival, no celebration. She simply danced, twisting, shaking, convulsing in the baking summer heat. Her husband begged her to stop. Neighbours watched in bewilderment. She did not or could not stop. She danced until she collapsed. She rested and then got up and danced again. For 4 days, then 5, then 6, on swollen, bloodied feet. Within a week, a dozen other people had joined her. Their movements were not celebratory. Witnesses described them as frenzied, pained, almost seizure-like. These people were not having fun. They appeared to be suffering. Within a month, August of 1518, the number had swelled to somewhere between 200 and 400 people, depending on which contemporary account you read. The streets of Strasbourg were clogged with dancing bodies, men, women, children, all seized by the same inexplicable compulsion. Some accounts, cited by historian John Waller, claim that for a period around 15 people per day were dying, from heart attacks, strokes and sheer exhaustion. The summer heat made it worse. Many hadn't slept in days. It's worth noting not everyone agrees on the death toll. Some historians are skeptical of the 15 per day figure, pointing out that many of the dramatic accounts were written decades or even centuries after the events occurred. The sources from the Strasbourg City Council at the time don't explicitly record fatalities, but they do record the dancing. The dancing was absolutely real. As the numbers grew, Strasbourg's civic and religious leaders were forced to act. And here's where the story takes a fascinatingly dark turn, because their response, shaped entirely by the medical understanding of the time, made everything catastrophically worse. The city's physicians were consulted, and they concluded, without any idea of what we know now about psychology or neurology, that the dancing was caused by overheated blood. Their prescription? The afflicted simply needed to dance it out, let the fever run its course. So the city council, taking the doctors at their word, did something extraordinary. They opened up the guild halls of Strasbourg and designated dancing spaces. They hired professional musicians to accompany the dancers. They even brought in strong men to hold the exhausted dancers upright so they could keep going. They were essentially running a forced dance marathon, and it worked about as well as you'd expect. The numbers exploded, more people joined in, the plague spread further. The music drew crowds, the crowds fed the frenzy, and the frenzy drew more people in. It was a feedback loop of collective madness. Within weeks, panic had replaced policy. The council banned public dancing entirely. They banned music, they shuttered the guild halls. Civic leaders began to wonder if this wasn't a medical problem at all, but a divine punishment. To understand how the dancing plague ended, you need to understand who Saint Vitus was, and what he meant to the 16th century Europeans. Saint Vitus was a Catholic martyr believed to have special powers over both illness and, crucially, dancing. Medieval Europeans believed that if you offended Saint Vitus, he could curse you to dance uncontrollably as divine punishment for your sins. It was a widely held belief, deeply embedded in the cultural and religious fabric of the region. There was even a condition named after him, Saint Vitus's dance, which we now know as Sydenham's chorea, a neurological disorder. The religious leaders of Strasbourg concluded that the dancers had been cursed by Saint Vitus himself as punishment for their sinfulness, and so they prescribed a religious cure. The remaining dancers were ordered to make a pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint Vitus at Savin, a mountain chapel outside the city. There, they were reportedly made to wear red shoes that had been sprinkled with holy water, painted with crosses on the soles and tops. They held small crosses in their hands. They endured incense, Latin incantations, and elaborate rituals of absolution. Word spread quickly that participants had been forgiven by Vitus, and slowly, over the course of early September 1518, the dancing stopped. Just as suddenly and mysteriously as it began, the dancing plague of 1518 was over. No one died on the way to the shrine. No one collapsed in the chapel. The cure, whatever it actually was, worked, which tells us something very important about what may have caused the plague in the first place. Here's something that might surprise you. The 1518 Strasbourg outbreak was not unique. It was not even the first time something like this had happened. Historians have documented roughly 20 comparable episodes of dancing mania, or choreomania, from the Greek word meaning dance, across Europe, occurring primarily between the 10th and 16th centuries. One of the earliest recorded incidents occurred on Christmas Eve in the German town of Kolbig in 1021. According to a local chronicler, 18 people gathered outside a church and began dancing with what he called wild abandon, clapping, leaping and chanting in a ring dance. The local priest, unable to perform mass because of the commotion, allegedly cursed them to dance for an entire year as punishment. According to the chronicle, it worked. Not until the following Christmas did the dancers regain control of their limbs. Some of them, it was said, never woke up from the deep sleep that followed. Now, this account was probably fabricated. It has the structure of a morality tale, but it shows us how deeply embedded the idea of cursed, compulsive dancing was in the medieval European psyche. Far better documented is the outbreak of 1374, which swept through multiple cities along the Rhine River, including Cologne, Maastricht, Liege, and most notably an earlier episode right there in Strasbourg, just a few years after the Black Death had decimated the population. It's not a coincidence that this 1374 outbreak followed the Black Death. The plague had killed between a third and a half of Europe's population. The psychological trauma was unimaginable, and it is in this aftermath of that collective horror that people began to dance. There were also several isolated incidents in Switzerland and the Holy Roman Empire during the 15 and 1600s, sometimes gripping a single person or even an entire family. And here's a remarkable footnote. The last recorded incident of dancing mania, according to some historians, may have occurred not in medieval Europe at all, but in Madagascar in 1863, which should raise some very interesting questions about what we think we know. Now we get to the question you've been waiting for. What actually caused the dancing plague of 1518? Because while we know it happened, the historical evidence is overwhelming, we still don't have a definitive answer. What we have are several competing theories, each with compelling evidence and frustrating gaps. Let's go through them. This is the most widely accepted explanation among modern historians and medical professionals. It was most thoroughly developed by John Waller of Michigan State University, and it goes by several names: mass hysteria, mass psychogenic illness, or mass psychogenic disorder. Here's the core idea. Under conditions of extreme prolonged stress, famine, disease, religious terror, and social collapse, the human mind can generate very real, very physical symptoms. Not imagined symptoms, actual physiological responses. Convulsions, uncontrollable movement, paralysis and blindness. And crucially, these symptoms can spread from person to person, not through a pathogen, but through observation and suggestion. We have actually seen this in the modern era. In 2011, a cluster of teenagers in Leroy, New York, developed unexplainable tics and twitching movements that spread through their school. In 2012, a similar outbreak occurred in a school in Colombia. These were diagnosed as mass psychogenic illness. Real symptoms, no physical cause. Now scale that up. Imagine you live in Strasbourg in 1518. You're starving, diseases everywhere, and you genuinely believe that a Christian saint has the power to curse you to dance. You see a woman dancing in the street, and somewhere in your already overwhelmed, terror-saturated brain, a switch flips. Waller also points to something crucial. The dancing plague fits a well-documented pattern. Mass psychogenic outbreaks tend to occur in populations under extreme stress. They tend to affect women and lower social classes disproportionately. Groups with less power, less agency, and more fear. And they tend to take the form of whatever the local culture most fears or believes in. In 1518 Strasbourg, the local belief was that sinners could be cursed to dance, so they danced. And here's the most compelling piece of evidence for this theory: the cure. When the authorities isolated the dancers, removed them from public view, sent them to a chapel away from the city, the plague ended. Isolation is the primary treatment for mass psychogenic illness. Whether by accident or intuition, the authorities had stumbled onto the right answer. The second major theory involves a far more tangible culprit, a toxic fungus called ergot, or Claviceps purpurea, which grows on rye and other damp grains. In times of famine and poor harvests, exactly like the ones plaguing Strasbourg in 1518, contaminated rye would end up in bread supply. And ergot is no ordinary mold. Consuming it causes a condition called ergotism, which can produce violent convulsions, hallucinations, burning sensations in the limbs, and yes, uncontrollable jerky movements that can look very much like dancing. There's even a historical connection to something far more famous. Many historians believe that the Salem witch trials of 1692 may have been partially triggered by ergot poisoning, producing the convulsions and visions that accusers reported. However, the ergot theory has serious problems when applied to 1518 specifically. Medical historian John Waller points out two major flaws. First, ergot poisoning typically causes gangrene, the blackening and dying of the extremities, particularly fingers and toes. Contemporary accounts mention none of this. Second, rye was not a primary food source everywhere dancing manias occurred, which is an incomplete explanation for the broader pattern of outbreaks across centuries. The ergot theory might explain some of the physical symptoms in some people, but it probably can't explain why the dancing spread so efficiently from person to person across such a wide area. American sociologist Robert Bartholomew proposed a more provocative theory, that the dancers were not victims at all, but adherents of heretical religious sects who were deliberately dancing as a form of spiritual expression or ritual penance, and that the plague framing was imposed by church and civil authorities who found the dancing threatening. This theory has some intriguing elements. Dancing as a form of religious ecstasy has deep roots across many cultures, and in the context of 1518, with Martin Luther's Reformation shaking the foundations of the Catholic Church, there were certainly religious movements operating outside the official doctrine. However, most historians found this theory unconvincing for one simple reason. The overwhelming contemporary testimony describes people who were clearly suffering and clearly did not want to be dancing. The accounts of the bloodied feet, desperate pleas to stop, and deaths from exhaustion did not fit the picture of a voluntary religious ritual. We can't discuss the dancing plague honestly without taking seriously the explanation that the people of 1518 themselves believed most fervently. That the dancers had been cursed by Saint Vitus or possessed by demons as divine punishment for their sins. To a 21st century audience, this sounds absurd, but here's the thing. The power of belief should never be underestimated, especially when we're already arguing that the most likely cause was a psychogenic illness driven by fear and religious belief. The Saint Vitus belief was not a fringe superstition. It was a mainstream, orthodox theology in 16th century Catholic Europe. People genuinely, completely and rationally, within the framework of their understanding of the world, believed that a saint could curse sinners to dance, and that belief may have been exactly what gave the plague its power. The fear of the curse could trigger the very symptoms of the curse, a self-fulfilling prophecy written in biology. Medical historian John Waller puts it beautifully in his article, The Lancet. The people of Strasbourg were not crazy, they were not stupid, they were traumatized human beings operating within a belief system that made perfect sense to them, and that very belief system became the mechanism of their suffering. You might be tempted to think of the dancing plague as a relic, a weird medieval footnote that couldn't happen today, but I'd push back on that. Mass psychogenic illness is not a historical curiosity. It is a documented, reoccurring feature of human psychology that appears wherever and whenever communities are placed under extreme stress. It appeared in factories in the early 20th century, in schools in the 21st, in villages, hospitals, military units, and refugee camps across the globe. And in 2020, film director Jonathan Glazer made a short film for the BBC called Strasbourg 1518, depicting performers from around the world dancing alone, isolated by the COVID-19 lockdowns until they collapsed. The film drew a direct and haunting parallel between the collective trauma of a pandemic-era world and the suffering of those Strasbourg dancers 500 years earlier. Even the 2022 Florence and the Machines album, Dance Fever, included a track called Choreomania, directly inspired by the dancing plague. Lead singer Florence Welch has spoken about the album's themes of compulsion, the body carrying grief, and the inability to stop moving even when you're falling apart. It is an almost perfect metaphor for what those Strasbourg dancers may have been going through. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Humans have always, under conditions of extreme stress and collective fear, done extraordinary and inexplicable things. We have always found ways to embody our trauma, to make the invisible pain visible. The dancing plague is not just a medieval mystery, it's a mirror, and it reflects something deeply, stubbornly human. By September of 1518, the dancing plague had ended. The streets of Strasbourg were quiet again. The dancers, those who survived, were led back from the mountain chapel. Life, such as it was, resumed. We still don't know exactly what happened. We may never know for certain. The most compelling explanation? Mass psychogenic illness, born of starvation, disease, religious terror, and the unique belief in St. Vitus's curse. Fits the evidence better than anything else we have, but it is a hypothesis, not a certainty. What we do know is this: 400 people in medieval city danced in agony for 2 months. It is documented, it is real, and it asks us a question we still haven't fully answered. How much of what we experience, what we feel, what we suffer, what our bodies do, is shaped not by germs or injuries or even by chance, but by what we believe, by the stories our culture tells us about the world, by the fears we share with people around us. The dancing plague of 1518 is strange. It is haunting and is sometimes darkly funny, but most of all, it is a reminder of something both humbling and a little terrifying. The human mind is capable of almost anything, including dancing itself to death. If you found this video interesting, drop a like and a comment below with what you think caused the dancing plague. Do you buy into the mass hysteria theory, or is there something else going on? And if you want more deep dives into history's strangest and most overlooked stories, make sure you subscribe. This has been Archive Shadows. Stay in the dark.